We are really honoured and thrilled that Dr. Michael Buxton could be with us today. Dr. Michael Buxton is Professor of Environment and Planning at RMIT University. He's held senior positions in 4 Victorian planning and environmental agencies and has contributed extensively to national and state environment and planning policy. Michael was also a councillor at Moorabbin at a very early age, I'm guessing about 12. He was a councillor and mayor of Sherbrooke Shire for 10 years and a member of the Upper Yarra Valley and Dandenong Ranges Authority for 6 years as well. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Michael Buxton.
Whenever I hear some of the sort of summary of who I'm supposed to be, I look back on a sort of career that's characterised by monumental failure, I think. When you look at everything that's being unravelled, you know, and you spend kind of half a lifetime doing what you all do. So I have great admiration for you in sticking it out. In fact, looking at some of the faces here, lots of you know a lot about the Metropolitan Strategy as it exists and have done lots of work in planning. So I'm just amazed at the breadth and the depth of interest and knowledge about planning in groups like this. So I don't understand, given that, how the government gets away with what it does. There's kind of something wrong in the way we all collaborate and mobilise, and I don't know how to get around that, because the development community is brilliant at getting around it. It has its paid peak groups like the Property Council and the Urban Development Institute, and they lobby and they walk into the Premier's office, and you all go and do it, you know, going up to Canberra in your own time, and it's so much harder for you, but somehow keep at it, because it's incredibly important. So thank you for inviting me here today. I'll talk for about, 20 minutes and stop, mercifully. Coming back here, I realised when I drove in, I've been here before. It's like one of those bad dreams, you know, and you realise where you've been. And I remember coming out here nearly 50 years ago to play football in the Oval next door from my little southern suburb in Parkdale, Mordialloc, where I eventually became a councillor. And I lined up at full forward, all 5'10" of me, against a 6'2" or 6'3" monster, and I realised he came out of the Housing Commission flats and that I was going to be in for a tough day, which I was, because every time I looked at the ball he thumped the hell out of me. And that was my introduction to the inner suburbs. I'd never come in here before, and I realised there's lots of issues in the inner suburbs, and I had a very interesting introduction, a very dramatic one to them, and I've never forgot it. So now I live in Collingwood, you know, and there's some interesting issues there. Okay, I'm not going to plough through the Metropolitan Policy Strategy document, because I'd clear the room in about 3 seconds, and you've all read it and you've got your own opinions. What I'd like to do is to just talk very briefly about where I think this is coming from and some of the kind of themes in it, and leave it at that. But try to provide some kind of framework to the process and some of the key issues and themes arising from the discussion paper. As you know, the government has released a discussion paper which is intended, in the words of the discussion paper, the aim is to help generate debate and discussion about the future of our city. A fairly laudable aim. But I think a discussion paper and a metropolitan strategy process has got to do a lot more than that. I'd like to try to explain what I think it should be doing, and maybe we can influence this process. Metropolitan plans or strategies are very important. Where they're done well, they affect the future of cities. Planning and planning decisions take place according to a long-term strategic set of objectives. They're long-term and they're bipartisan, and there are some very good examples of that kind of process, and the cities that have that long-term overall strategic planning identify the key issues, where they're going, alternatives, and how they're going to achieve that kind of vision and plan, they prosper, I think. You get consistency, you get everybody knowing the rules, you know where everybody knows where they're going, and eventually they pull together. Where you don't have that, you have everybody after their chop, particularly if they've got a vested interest in it. So it's a free-for-all, it's a bun fight. And that's what we're seeing in Melbourne now as never before. I've been hanging around kind of planning since I first got elected to the old Mordialloc Council in 1972 as a kind of completely naive young person, and now I'm a, you know, hard-bitten, cynical old person. And I have never known a time like this in Melbourne's history. It is a free-for-all. Developers are putting forward their own ambit claims on everything, on height, on type of development, on where it's going to be. They've had an incredibly powerful influence on the new zones, and they love this kind of anarchic, no rules environment. They whinge about it, but ultimately they love it because they just keep upping the ambit. They just keep coming in with ambit claims, and even if they get knocked back a little bit, which under this government they usually don't anymore. Usually they'd put in a kind of 16-storey or 20-storey tower and they'd get a couple of stories knocked off and they'd go laughing to the nearest wine bar with $200 champagne, drinking about how dumb the government was, because they still got more than they really ever wanted. Now, developers love that kind of free-for-all environment because they're very, very good at profiting from it. They lobby, they go direct to ministers. They say they want certainty and rules, but they lobby to stop that happening. So I've never known a situation like this. It's incredibly serious for Melbourne. When you look at the rapidity and the scale of development, it's uncoordinated, nobody knows where it's going. This is a very, very serious moment for Melbourne. That's why strategic planning is important, to set out a long-term vision and the implementation of that vision so we can all work together. And where that happens in cities successfully, the city prospers because everybody gets behind the plan. Land values stabilise. People aren't rushing in, speculating, trying to get a benefit themselves at the cost of everybody else. This happens, believe it or not, across the world in many places, and everybody benefits, and we're not in that space. Somehow we've got to get back to it. It's critical that we do. It's going to be a hard task because I think the other sort of framework, element of the framework that I just want to mention briefly is that we are being governed by what I'd call neoliberal extremists right across, almost across this country at a state level and partly at a federal level too. That is deregulation extremists. I mean, these basically the deregulators have won at every level. If you want to get a sense of this, have a look at the recent reports by some of the key authorities, Victorian Efficiency and Competition Commission, the Productivity Commission report recently on planning. Have a look at the language and also the government's economic strategy, which it released on almost on Christmas Eve. It was supposed to be a great achievement, but it got lost when everyone was rushing off out on their holidays, which sort of probably talks more about the government's incompetence because it was supposed to be a big statement. But the language of deregulation in those kind of statements has set the framework. And we've now got premiers who are radical deregulators of the likes we've never seen before, from Campbell Newman right around now to Western Australia. And planning is a critical issue. There's a huge bun fight brewing in New South Wales. over further deregulation. Campbell Newman in Queensland is trying to further deregulate already probably the most deregulated planning regime in the world. He's not happy. He's never going to be happy until there's absolutely nothing left. So we're in the middle of a political climate that is incredibly radical. It's not just Dracula being put in charge of the blood bank, it's kind of Dracula's children running the show, and to my horror, Dracula was a pretty fecund sort of a person. He had lots of children, and they're all around at the moment. They're sort of free market radicals, which is kind of only one step less worse than free radicals, which are all taking almond tablets every day to stop, we're not trying to stop getting cancer from free radicals. These people are free market radicals, and I think they're bad news. But they're behind this philosophy. So you find this expressed, I've seen some of you sum this up, you find this expressed in the discussion paper, and it's quite clearly expressed as a background philosophy. The Metropolitan Planning Strategy, it says, must move away from regulation as the primary means of achieving planning outcomes. Now, to me, that really sums up where this Metropolitan Strategy discussion paper is coming from. How can it put forward what a discussion paper in this kind of framework should put forward? That is, a series of well-considered, well-researched options with lots of information supporting them, analysing key issues, presenting considered options, and looking at serious implementation measures in the context of an overall long-term vision for Melbourne linked to a series of implementation themes and policies. Now that's what I would expect a discussion paper to do. Seriously put out a lot of information that was framed in a context around themes, well-considered options, with a sense of where it all could go. Now, in the past, that sort of is what's happened. The Border Works in 1954 and in 1971 put out a series of well-considered reports, lots of information. You can still see these in libraries. The 54 plan took years to develop. The 71 plan took years to develop. Now, they're the plans. The 71 plan is the plan that set Melbourne up 40 years. It's now been trashed. It was finished off by Brumby and Baillieu working together in 2010, originally in 2008, but finally they put through the urban growth boundary expansions in 2010. But that plan from Sir Rupert Hamer and people like Alan Hunt set Melbourne up in a long-term strategic structure. Now that's a strategy. It was informed, people knew where it was going, there was lots of discussion, options were considered. The Border Works, that's the way they approach things. And the government right up into the early 90s approached strategy preparation in this way. And the strategies were consistent with that original 71 plan. That all went out the window when the Kennett government was elected. The 2002 strategy attempted to try to get some kind of strategic approach to the future of Melbourne, and what it did that interested me was it set up an alternative scenario. It said if we continue to go the way we are, we're going to build into our green wedges in a certain way, but it attempted to shift about 40% of the planned outer urban growth back into the existing metropolitan area. That was a very controversial policy because they didn't think through how that could be done, and it caused lots of conflict and so on. But it was a strategy. Like it or not, it was a strategic intervention into business as usual business as usual trends by altering what the market was going to do. So it was a strategy, and the situation we're in now is that we have a government which, like the Kennett government, doesn't believe in strategy. It believes in leaving as much as possible to the market. So we have a discussion paper which says that metropolitan strategy should not be focused primarily on regulation, that is, intervention into markets. Now, I guess the problem that raises for me is that strategic plans for cities are the proper province of governments. They presume a strong role for government. They presume that the government plans with communities, with business and so on, but fundamentally it's a government activity. You don't give over strategic planning for a city to BHP or the Property Council. Government, it implies a strong role for government, and yet we have a strategic a discussion paper for the Melbourne strategy accepting that there should not be a strong role for government. So there's an extraordinary contradiction and admission that really condemns the whole strategic planning process to failure, because underlying it there is not, we know there's not going to be a strongly intervening, interventionist government process setting an alternative future. So that's what I think a discussion paper should do. When governments set about planning for strategic futures for cities, they can either do it in a participatory way, they can go out to people, they can set up broad participation processes, which isn't the same as consultation. It's proper involvement by people in the process, helping set the directions and the policies. Or it can consult, it can put out a series of themes and do what the Board of Works did, that model that I just talked about. It wasn't a proper participatory model, but it was an informed consultative model. But we have a third approach, which is, I think, token participation, token consultation, and basically a discussion paper that is left with very little to say. And it's no accident that it doesn't say much. It's fundamentally, I think, a list of ideas that have been gleaned from all over the place and cobbled together without any overall thematic structure, without any underlying or stated vision. We don't know where it's going. We don't know how those elements interact. There's no background information. There's no considered options. It's just a list, a grab bag of ideas that they've got from all sorts of sources and cobbled together. There's nothing like it ever, in my view, nothing like it ever happened before in the history of strategic planning in Melbourne, in Victoria. So I'm pretty pessimistic about where it's going. I think if community groups can try to intervene in the process and try to turn that around towards a much more, a much clearer statement of what the government intends, what the community sector intends, and try to set agendas. A lot of this is about agenda setting. And I think this struggle in the next couple of months is about the community groups like yourselves setting the agenda or attempting to set the agenda, because at the moment the agenda is clear. As little government intervention into the market as possible. If that's the kind of strategy we want, it's an enabling strategy which isn't going to really do anything for Melbourne in the medium or long term. Okay, now I'll just finish up by just mentioning a couple of the, just one other comment on that background process. I think the other reason why the discussion paper isn't really able to say much about strategic futures for Melbourne is that most of the decisions about Melbourne's future have already been made outside the strategic planning process. What can a strategy say about activity centre planning when the new zones, the new commercial zones, allow virtually unregulated commercial development away from town centres, away from strip centres, out away from public transport, much of it as of right. So where the commercial zones are going to foster out-of-centre development, big box retailing, much of it as of right. Now you can't have an activity centres policy when you've, in a strategy like this, if you already want zones and already exhibited zones which basically have a free-for-all for big box retailing out of activity centres. It's just impossible. How can you have a strategy which attempts to limit outer urban growth when Baillieu connived with Brumby to allow a massive expansion of the urban growth boundary by 43,000 hectares a few years ago, and Matthew Guy, not to be satisfied with a 30-year land supply, has added another 6,000 hectares to that amount? It's insane. There's no logic to it, but it immediately preempts any strategic principle based on limiting Melbourne's outer urban growth. Can't be put in a strategy. That's why the strategy says nothing meaningful about these kind of critical issues: inner urban intensification, activity centres, outer urban growth. There's virtually nothing of consequence in the discussion paper about any of those issues because the decisions have already been made outside the strategy process. Now, just to finish up, I'll just try to glean some of the key issues and just really mention them. So I said there's a list that's fairly arduous, I think, going through this list because it's difficult to see connections and so on. But when we look at the structure, it talks about the importance of networking Melbourne with regional cities, and I think that is a really good idea. Underlying the strategy is the only really overarching strategic principle I can find is an acceptance of growth to Melbourne to 6.4 million by 2050. This discussion paper doesn't discuss this principle in any detail, and that's one of my objections to it. It kind of accepts that it's going to happen, and then it says we cannot go on planning the way we have. We can't continue with business as usual planning. There's a kind of a contradiction there that I don't know whether the advisory committee picked up. That is business as usual growth, 6.4 million people by 2050. Now, okay, within that you can change the way Melbourne is shaped and functions, but that's about the only overarching principle I can see, and it's a bad one. Then the strategy goes, and the discussion paper talks a bit about networks between regional cities and Melbourne, and this is a good thing because traditionally, 2/3 of the Australian population live in the capital cities. This is relatively unusual in the world, and networking Melbourne with regional centres I think is a really good idea, but it involves incredible complexity. How many people should be encouraged to go and live in Ballarat, Bendigo and Geelong? What type of development should be permitted there? At the moment it's business as usual development on the fringe. You go to Armstrong Creek on the fringes of Geelong, Ballarat West, they're just going to be rezoned areas with large numbers of detached houses, a long way from the town centres with no public transport. This is business as usual planning shifted from Melbourne to fringe areas of regional cities. I don't think that's a good idea, but there's no real discussion of that in this discussion paper. Is it a good idea maybe to increase the size of some of the smaller townships along some of the so-called faster rail routes? For example, the Melbourne to Bendigo link along the Calder. And if so, how big should those small towns grow to? I mean, the community groups up there don't want that to happen. Is it a good idea or not? But there's no real basis for investigating that kind of decision. Another principle is this idea of a polycentric city that you would have seen in the discussion paper. This is the idea of having a multi-centred focus to a city like Melbourne, and the discussion paper suggests that that multi-centred approach be then linked to regional centres. Now, okay, that's an idea well worth considering. Melbourne has tended to operate on this centre periphery model with real focus going right back to the district centre policy and the Board of Works. Nothing should threaten the dominance of the CBD, and it's incredibly important to maintain a strong CBD. But in the meantime, we've got out-of-centre development with big malls, car-based malls, planned by the big retailers. Now, it's not a good idea either. So we've got a kind of de facto polycentric city fundamentally based on retailing. To what extent should we have different centres around Melbourne based on different things? Employment nodes, housing concentrations around public transport. Okay, let's discuss that. It's a good idea. But when you actually go in and have a look at what this strategy means, it's most unsatisfactory consideration. It said the polycentric idea that they have is strong CBD, a limited number of activity centres, a few innovation clusters, it calls them, and it lists the Monash, Clayton, Melbourne Airport and Parkville biosciences precincts. They're all incredibly different. The Melbourne Airport precinct is dominated at this stage by big box retailing, which shouldn't even be there because it's car-based out-of-centre retailing. They're all very different. So a limited number of these innovation clusters and the whole of inner Melbourne as a cluster. Now, the whole of inner Melbourne as an element in a polycentric city, to me, doesn't make the slightest bit of sense. For a start, it's huge. There are many different activity centres in inner Melbourne. That's where most of our advanced business service employment and most of our professional advanced business service employees live and is located. It's a huge area. It's incredibly important to the future of Melbourne. But to talk of it as a kind of great amorphous single element in a polycentric city, I don't think makes any sense. And that's it. And then it talks about local clusters, local activity centres, and it doesn't really develop any framework for linking local and these few activity centres. So is it going back to the old Board of Works limited number of district centres, or is it really going to the Melbourne 2030 idea of 900 local and larger activity centres? Nobody knows. It's not spelt out. So that idea of a polycentric city needs an enormous amount more work. It's no help at the moment. It says nothing about out-of-centre retailing, the biggest threat to activity centres in the future. Talks about global connectivity, and that's always said to be a great idea, but it doesn't say anything about, I think, this other idea of how important it is for cities like Melbourne to link themselves to their hinterlands in all sorts of functional ways in the next generation or two. I think the cities that survived this century, and there's a lot of evidence for this, that the cities that survived this century are going to be the ones that most successfully relate to their hinterlands, maintain their food sources, their local and regional assets, their natural resource values, their water, their beautiful landscapes. There's huge amount of money linked with this, money from amenity. And finally, urban form. It really doesn't come up with a coherent vision of the future urban form for Melbourne. It really doesn't say much at all about what do we do about Melbourne's intensification. It says it's a good idea to have intensified cities, but it doesn't tell us why that's a good idea and where the intensification should be located. Again, unlike Melbourne 2030, which said we should focus intensification around mixed-use activity centres. without explaining how and what the ramifications were, but at least it was a vision. This doesn't have, this discussion paper doesn't really tell us how it wants that to happen. It doesn't, for example, analyse the half dozen major models of future urban form in Melbourne, from the Rob Adams model of redeveloping all the major arterial routes along tram lines into 1 million more people along those tram routes, through to intensified activity centres, brownfield development, or just random development everywhere, which is what's tending to happen now. So we just don't get discussion on these major pressure points of inner city, outer growth areas and activity centres. And one more principle, I'm amazed that it says so little about amenity. I couldn't find the word heritage in the discussion paper. Maybe I went to sleep 3/4 way through, and I didn't have a fine button because I didn't have an electronic version of this, but I couldn't find the word heritage. Maybe it's in there somewhere. I would, and you know, as you know, for those of you that read it, it puts forward a series of principles which I think are relatively meaningless because they don't link they don't explain the principles properly or link them to a series of themes or options or potential policies. But if I were going to develop a theme, and I may as well put my credentials on the table, I would put amenity and heritage at the top, because heritage and amenity are fundamentally critical to a city's future in ways that just about every principle I can think of are not. It's critical for the identity of the citizens of the city. I kind of take photos of tourists taking photos of our heritage buildings. I love it. And people have said to me, if only Melbourne had been left like it was in the 50s, it would have been a great jewel of the Southern Hemisphere. And people look at you as if you're crazy when you say that. Really? Have they ever been to Europe? The people who have a go at you for saying that are the very people who trot over to Europe every year and swan around the heritage cities of Europe. And yet they look at you as if you belong in a lunatic asylum and you say, why isn't Melbourne still like that? One of the great Victorian cities on earth. Another great Victorian city that I went to relatively recently was Calcutta. I couldn't believe it. A CBD the size of Melbourne, totally intact, high Victorian city. One of the most incredible places I've ever been to. There it is. Now, this is not an unrealisable dream. The inner suburbs, miraculously, despite incredible pressure, are still savable. They're still relatively intact. The CBD is being pulled down at an unprecedented rate of knots, but if this was stopped with a vision even remotely resembling the one that the Melbourne City Council put out last year to try and protect its lanes and introduce height controls, I don't think it went anywhere near far enough, but at least it was a step in the right direction. This is still able to be saved as a fundamental principle for the future of Melbourne, not just for amenity, not just for identity and all those fuzzy values, which are terribly important to people who live in beautiful places, but economically. The people with money live in the areas with the greatest heritage. Lots of other people like us who don't have a lot of money live there too, but that's fine. But the advanced business service sector, as I said before, is located in the inner suburbs. They have been drawn to the strip centres, which the new commercial zones will pull down. Now, it is absolutely crazy to be pulling this down from a financial and economic. This is, Melbourne's heritage is its greatest economic strength, without a doubt, for all sorts of reasons. And yet, it's not mentioned in this discussion paper. So, in summary, I'm very worried about all this as a direction. I don't know how it can be turned around other than pressure. This discussion paper is totally inadequate as a contribution to the development of a metropolitan strategy. It is inadequate for reasons, and I've tried to suggest what some of those reasons are. The result is something that cannot be let stand. When the strategy comes out, it has to do at least some of the things that I've suggested it should do. And finally, it should focus on implementation and governance. It's going to be very difficult to get a government that doesn't believe in government to adopt a strong metropolitan strategy that intervenes into an alternative future. We do have to get alternative futures. We can't go on the way we're going. It's a great tragedy for Australia that we're at a time when we need leaders in politics who understand the world is changing at an incredible rate, fundamentally changing the planet. They don't get that. They want to give away government to the people that are causing the planet to change so dramatically. Now, it's a huge issue for the people of Australia. Why, when we need visionary leaders who believe in government and community most, have we got people who hate government and are giving the game away to the people who are destroying the place? That's a fundamental issue, and it comes right back to metropolitan planning. That's what we've got here. So we're not going to get a strong implementation plan because there'll be nothing to implement the way we're going. I think that's over to all of us and people like us to try to get in there and stand up for Melbourne and for the broader public interest, because it's not going to be protected otherwise.
We'll thank Michael. Really very great.